Welcome to the home of Toni Siegel, who's invited us in to hear her life story. She's lived in Falls, George alongside the Housatonic River over 40 years, first as a weekender from New York City, and then permanently with her husband, Peter Sturdivant. You want to tell me the story of your life, where you were born, and because I don't know anything about you, Toni.
Right, you don't, except that Mary told you to come see me.
And she said you were fascinating and wonderful, and that's good enough for me.
Okay, well, the story of my life is long and complicated. I was born in New York, ended up growing up for most of my school years in New Rochelle, which is a suburb of New York. Went to college in Philadelphia, and came back to New York. And in 25 words or less, my first job was as a secretary, entry-level job at CBS News in documentaries. And then I moved from there to hard news. I was working Walter Cronkite at that time.
This is my last broadcast as the anchorman of the CBS Evening News. And anyway, the person who sits here is but the most conspicuous member of a superb team of journalists. Writers, reporters, editors, producers, and none of that will change.
Anything I did, my tiny entry-level job, had to do with graphics. So one of the things it had to do with was graphics. So it would be my responsibility to make sure the right picture, you know how you see a newscaster and there's a picture behind them? So it'd be to make sure the right picture was in the right technician's hands at the right time, so when Walter or Dan or anybody else was talking about, you know, a car or something, there'd be a picture of a car. It was my job. And I learned very rapidly that millions of people would see what I did. I made mistakes like everybody else, but like I once spelled integration wrong. I mean, I made mistakes, but that there would be millions of people, and that was before cable, so really millions of people seeing your work. The politics were brutal. And then there was the women's movement. First I got really discouraged because I once actually applied for a job which required traveling. And I was told, oh, you couldn't hire a woman for that job. What would the men's wives think? So, yeah, exactly. So I got discouraged. While I was still at CBS, I went to night school, graduate school, to get a degree in teaching children with reading disabilities, because I had a friend who had a son who was about 6, 7, and he was really struggling in school. And I thought, wouldn't it be wonderful if I could help children like him? So I go and I get my degree, and simultaneously I'm still at CBS. This must have been sometime in the early 70s, because it was the time when the women's movement was just taking off, and there were a group of women from Newsweek and a group of women from Time magazine and a couple other places who had gone to court about women's opportunities, and this was the time of the Warren Court. So it went to the Supreme Court, and it was decided that women counted under Title IX, I guess. Anyway, so I was getting very discouraged. I got this degree, was going to leave television altogether. And I was interviewing at a top-rate private school, and I get a phone call from my office. Don't sign anything, don't do anything, everybody here is looking for you. And so what had happened was that Bill Paley, who was at the time the head of CBS, had kind of sent around a memo to all the managers saying, we're not getting caught in this women's issue, and make sure you've got women, you know, around. So there weren't that many women who were interested in production as I was. It was a more technical thing than editorial, which was telling the story. This was kind of making sure the story got on the air. So they were looking for me to see if I was still interested in working. So I became the first woman in the Directors Guild for CBS News. And I worked in control rooms, and I worked in editing, and I worked in all over for 19 years. During the course of that time, I became the first woman to put a live news show on the air. It was a minute, it was a news break, but it was still live news. And it was horrible because being the first at anything is tough, and I didn't have the personality for it. So, I mean, I just wasn't strong enough, Anyway, that went on for 19 years, and it was great, and I met my husband there. And working in the news business is just about the most fascinating thing anybody can do. As they say, you have a front seat at history. So anyway, I met my husband there, and eventually I left, and I went to Sesame Street. It was Sesame Street's 20th anniversary, and I was the point person for all the various events, which included an exhibition at MoMA, and an exhibition at the Smithsonian, and a weekend we had for all the local PBS stations. We sent people. So then I got tired of that, and in parallel to all this, I had met my husband, I had had a child. I had also gotten discouraged once again and went to business school. At Columbia, they had a special executive program where you could go while you were working. And so I went to that, I got my degree, and again, I was frustrated because it was hard to get a job, even though at that time it was less of a problem for women. It was still a problem for women. And then my daughter was born, and I decided I didn't want to work at all. I mean, not at all, but barely. And I was the type of woman that was negotiating a contract while I was in labor, because it hadn't occurred to me not to negotiate a contract, and it hadn't occurred to me I was in labor. Both of those things. Anyway, so I decided, I ended up quitting all my jobs and becoming just freelancer and a full-time mother. And that continued for a couple of years. And and my daughter eventually ended up in nursery school. So at that time they were looking for parent volunteers to do whatever. So I volunteered. My weak point was writing, because I'd been in TV production for so long. I'd been working with cameras, with visuals, and I hadn't been writing scripts. So my weak point was writing. So at her nursery school, I volunteered to become the editor of the parent newsletter, which was very low stakes, very low visibility, but it gave me a chance to strengthen one of my weak points. When she went to kindergarten, I started volunteering in the library in her school, and long story short, while I was volunteering, which is very common, parent volunteers in children's libraries, the clerical person left, and they asked me if I wanted to be the clerical person in this lower school library, which I did. And so from there, I ended up getting a career. I went to library school. I got a degree in library science, which is now my third master's. And I ended up with a career that lasted about 15 years as a children's librarian. I worked in a couple of different schools, and that's what I retired from. Since I retired, my husband had became ill, so I became his caretaker for many years, which was in its own way a delight. I don't know how to say that, but as eulogy, I said I married my husband twice. Once when we were young and had all the excitement of new love, and once when he got sick, and it was a choice all over again. Do I want to spend the rest of my life with this man? And the answer was yes. And so it was a new kind of marriage vow, a new type of marriage. So that went on for 7 years, I guess, 8 years. And then he died about 4 years ago. He's buried up here. Many, many years before that, we, being up in Falls Village, had been one of the places we were the happiest with each other, with family, and just happy. And so there's a cemetery near Point of Rocks Road, and we decided to buy some cemetery plots there. This is before we knew that he was going to have this chronic illness. We were both happy and healthy and loved it here and felt we were belonged. And so we bought these cemetery plots, and now he's buried here, which is wonderful. because I'm going to start crying again 4 years later. But now on certain days, I take my reading chair, my lawn chair, I go up to the cemetery, read a book, and I'm with him again. Okay. Oh, one thing very important. I'm my husband's second wife, so he had a daughter with his first wife, my stepdaughter, and she has become my daughter. So she's every bit as much a part of my life as my biological daughter. So I basically have two children, and my husband who died. That's right. When I met my husband, he had a house up here, which was on the same spot, but it was this tiny little house. I can actually show you a picture. And eventually, there were holes in the walls. There was trees growing on the roof, and we knew we needed to do something. So we renovated with a local contractor. And the house is actually pretty much the same size. We just raised the roof. Especially when my husband died, even before that, but especially when he died, I wanted to become, I always felt I was part of this community, but I wanted to meet more people and become more. So I'm on the board of the library, I'm the secretary, and so I feel really strongly that that's my opportunity, that's what I can do to give back. So that's what I'm doing, and of course that makes you more part of the community, which was important to me.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting about your background at CBS.
Yeah, people seem to think that's interesting. I feel like in some ways it's not the most interesting part of my life. It just, the only reason I even mention it is because it gives people a grounding place to understand.
What is the most interesting part of your life?
I knew you were going to ask that. In my adult years, I have become very interested in my religion, which is being Jewish. And I've been raised in what they call a secular Jewish home. So we had a lot of, the word is Yiddishkeit, which means Jewish culture, without having a lot of Jewish religion. And I'd been raised that way, and it didn't really matter to me much. And then, as an adult, I ended up rediscovering it. And so in many ways, the most interesting part of my life has been rediscovering, or maybe discovering for the first time, the huge intellectual challenges of any religion, the beauty of the social service, how you go out to help people in all religions. And to me, placing myself in this particular religion where I was born, and the things I've learned, the people I've met, the opportunity, I love hearing what we call divorce, a word, like a sermon. So I really feel like I'm learning every day, which is really important. And I actually joined a Bible study group in Lime Rock at Trinity, Episcopalian Church in Lime Rock, because I felt like, I joined about 2 years ago because I felt like I wanted to learn about it. And so that's been a real joy in my life. Being a parent, of course, is almost impossible to put into words. I thought I didn't want children, and then, because I was so busy with my life, but then I met Peter, and I knew I wanted children, his children, and so we got married, and that happened. So what you learn as a parent about yourself, about the world around you, about watching a child discover, and discovering a child You know, I don't think as a parent you create a child, I think as a parent you discover that child. And I remember one day particularly, my daughter was very little and I was washing her in the sink, and she's sitting in the sink, and I must have turned the water on or off with the faucet, and she looks at me and looks at me and looks at the faucet, looks at me, looks at the faucet, takes her hand, turns the lever, looks at the water coming out in absolute awe, turns the lever off the other way, the water stops. And she's now going back and forth, and you could see her learning that she could control the water with this thing that wasn't actually near the water. I mean, it wasn't a faucet, and that she could do it with her hand. And you could just watch this process. And that happened, you know, so many times when you're a parent. You just watch a child. I think what I'd like to offer to you for this purpose is how extremely important this town has been to me, particularly in the last several years. It was important enough that my husband and I, Pete Lawson was actually still the first selectman, I think, which is a long time ago. My husband and I decided we want to be buried here. We wanted to spend eternity here. And he said, weekenders never want this. And we said, you know, we're only here during the weekend because our jobs make it, you know, in those days you couldn't work from home, and, you know, you couldn't do that. And our jobs make it impossible. I mean, there wasn't a TV studio in Falls Village where Walter Cronkite was. Our jobs make it impossible for us to live here full time, but we don't feel less that this is an important place in our lives than we would if we just came through on weekends. And I think that's been really important. And I think for this purpose, I just want to say that.
Good.
I don't feel less like I care about this town. You know, when we were here weekends, I'd bring my daughter to Cookie. Do you remember Cookie? She was the children's librarian, Cookie Kubarak.
Yeah.
She was the children's librarian at the library, and we went for story hour. And actually, when I was in library school getting my master's, one of my courses was about different types of libraries. And we each had to write a paper and give a presentation, and I chose the Hunt Library and Cookie. And I wrote my paper about how the Hunt Library is the center of the town, and I wish I could find it. It was many computers ago, and somewhere I'm sure it exists, but that's what I wrote my paper on for library school. So it's a very important time. It's been a very important time being here, a very important place. So, yeah.
Good. Well, thank you, Toni.
Thank you. It's so nice to think back.